Hello, everyone, and welcome to our fourth Distinguished Professor Lecture Series, today featuring Dr. Paul Harvey. I am your Vice Provost and Associate Vice Chancellor for Research, Jessie Smith, and I use she, her pronouns. I do want to start off by acknowledging that this land on which we sit today is the occupied land from our Indigenous peoples, and acknowledging that is just very one small way we can honor, celebrate, dismantle harm, and recognize our own positionalities. Before we begin today, I have a few quick logistics. You will have an opportunity to ask questions after the presentation, and you'll be invited to use the microphone or just talk in your best teacher voice to ask your question at the end. Also, please do feel free to get up during the presentation to get some snacks or beverages throughout the event. But now to get us started, it is my privilege to first introduce our Chancellor, Venkat Reddy, to the stage.
Thank you, Jessie. Exciting event, and I was telling Paul what an appropriate topic for the day, or for the times. So, good afternoon and welcome to the Distinguished Professor Lecture Series. So coming together like this is an exciting way to connect and learn something new, which is after all at the heart of our academic mission. So I'm glad that you all made it. I just saw people rolling out new tables, so that's a really good thing. So as this is the fourth in our series, you might already be familiar with the designation of Distinguished Professor. But just in case, let me give you a little history. The title Distinguished Professor is the highest rank and honor that the University of Colorado system bestows on its own faculty members. On December 15, 1977, the Board of Regents established the designation Distinguished Professor at the University of Colorado Boulder. Just a few years later, on October 17, 1980, the board extended the title to all campuses of the university. Many of you might know, many of the CU campuses were extensions of Boulder for the longest time. So CU Distinguished Professors demonstrate exemplary performance in research, have a record of excellence in classroom teaching and supervision of individual learning, and demonstrate outstanding leadership and service to the university, the profession, and or the public. Now we have many truly outstanding faculty at UCCS, but the title Distinguished conveys that this is a very select and honored few who are thought leaders, trailblazers, and exemplary scholars as affirmed by national and international resources. To date, we had 11 faculty achieve this highest rank and recognition at UCCS, 8 of whom are still actively engaged in our campus today. So we're very fortunate for that. So to introduce our speaker today, I turn it over to our Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost, Nancy Marchand-Martella. Nancy.
All right, thank you. How's everybody doing? Excited? All right, I am as well. So thank you, Chancellor. As noted, this marks the fourth installment of this lecture series at UCCS. I'm excited to learn from Dr. Harvey. Certainly looking forward to it. It's my privilege to introduce him and to tell you just a little bit about his extraordinary career. Paul Harvey is a distinguished professor of history. He received his PhD in American history from the University of California, Berkeley in 1992. He was a Lilly postdoctoral fellow at Valparaiso University. What state is that in? Good job. Okay, we're just talking about Indiana. I'm from Indiana, right? We gotta just, okay. So he was a Lilly postdoctoral fellow at Valparaiso University and taught at Colorado College before he joined faculty in 1996. Dr. Harvey earned the title Presidential Teaching Scholar in 2009 and received the rank of Distinguished Professor in 2017, the first person in the humanities at UCCS to have received that rank. Happily now there are 2 others from humanities with that title. Dr. Harvey is the author and editor of 15 books and numerous articles, most recently including Howard Thurman and the Disinherited, a religious biography published in 2020, as the first full academic biography of this central figure of American religious history, and Martin Luther King, A Religious Life in 2021, described by one reviewer as a book that should, I'm going to quote here, take a prominent place on the shelf of literature about a man who changed 20th century America. A previous book, The Color of Christ, The Son of God, and the Saga of Race in America, published in 2012, was listed that year as one of the top 25 academic books of 2012. And another work, Through the Storm, Through the Night, A History of African American Christianity, from 2011, received the same award. Wow, you've been busy. In 2019, Harvey received the Pennington Prize from the Faculty of History and Theology, Heidelberg University in Heidelberg, Germany, one of 10 American scholars to have received that award since its inception. The award is given to scholars who have done distinguished work on topics important to James W.C. Pennington, and it relates to slavery, emancipation, peace, education reform, civil rights, religion, and intercultural understanding. Dr. Harvey is currently working on 2 books, a work on global religious responses to World War II, to be published later with Yale University Press, and another forthcoming from Oxford University Press that gives the title for today's talk, Religion, Race, and Democracy in American History. Believe it or not, Dr. Harvey also has a little bit of time in his very busy and productive life for some fun, though as he tells it, thanks to knee and ankle pain, he has recently retired from a bad 40-year career of playing noontime basketball. But he has no plans to retire from writing history. It is with this wonderful legacy that I'm eagerly awaiting to hear from Dr. Harvey. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming to the stage Dr. Paul Harvey.
Thank you all for coming here. Especially want to thank several students that I see here. Will, David, Jeff, I thought you were in Minnesota at the Polish Museum. What are you doing here? Former student Eric, who I now work with as a colleague, Tara Harvey, no relation, sitting there. Thank you all, and other colleagues, Jenna, thank you for being here. And it's been a great pleasure to work here for 27 years with great colleagues. And I want to start with a little shout out to some previous distinguished professor talks, because I've been to the other 3. Because I was looking at them and I was thinking, what am I doing here exactly? For example, talked by Bob Canley a year or 2 ago, how a series of my mistakes led to explaining a Nobel Prize winning effect. So have I, like Bob Canley, worked with Nobel Prize winners and helped invent fundamentally new concepts that have a great impact on our everyday life? For example, he worked on the thing, which is why we can put 10 zillion terabytes on a single hard drive. So the team that did that. So my talk might better be called how a series of my mistakes and happy accidents led me to write some stuff. You might say, have I created new theories of human psychology, gotten a bunch of patents, started a new business here, like Dr. Aujal, a new distinguished professor, and gone to the fields of East Africa and dug up stuff for the first time, as have Dr. Wynn. And while you're pondering that question, I will give you a hint. No. That would be the answer. And so what do historians and many other humanists do other than reprise fundamental questions that have been tossed about for centuries? We go over the same material and look at the same material that our ancient predecessors did. And although I am not a scholar of ancient history, my colleague Jenna Rice is here. I'm going to talk about a couple of scholars of ancient history because I blame them. Herodotus and Thucydides. I'm going to vastly oversimplify, excuse me, Jenna, what I'm about to say, because I know it's more complicated than this. But these are kind of the prototypical debate in history is kind of bottom up versus top down. So Herodotus liked to tell stories and would say, I went to some place in Egypt and hey, this guy told me this. I don't know if it's true, I'm just going to write it down because it's interesting. There's a lot of writing like that. Thucydides is the classic. So Herodotus kind of appeals to social historians typically. Thucydides appeals to political historians. The scholar Donald Kagan recently published this book on Thucydides, and it's about great power conflicts and great men's thoughts and how they impact the wars of the era, the Peloponnesian War in particular. And so the discipline in history has long been a kind of ping-pong match between these two different kinds of approaches. The one thing all historians share in common, anybody know what that is? The thrill of writing and the agony of defeat in writing. So as Franz Kafka put it, on whatever year this was, February 7th, complete standstill, unending torments. I like to put this in my graduate research syllabi. Because writing is difficult. The cliche, I hate writing, but I love having written, certainly applies to me. And it applies to really everyone that I've ever known in the Guild. So another way to put this, who should we really be studying as historians? Those in power or those subject to those in power? To put this in the context of the American Revolution, for example, was it about home rule or was it about who should rule at home? That's a classic debate that American historians have. Was the Constitution anti-slavery or not? Read the New York Review of Books and you will see a fusillade of battles between historians on what would seem to be a pretty simple question, but in fact is not. In the context of the Civil War, who freed the slaves? Those in power who made policy, Lincoln and others, or those who, utterly lacking power, took action that forced the hands of those who made policies? So in my case, I like to study and teach about both. I'd like to talk about Thomas Jefferson and his visions for independence and, didn't work. Thomas Jefferson and his visions for independence and equality, and those who took his words, followed them, and created the largest and most powerful slaveholding society in the history of the modern world. And not coincidentally, the Civil War, costing 750,000 lives, the current day equivalent of 8 million Americans dying in 4 years. And how did they do this? They did it by doing what Americans are supposed to do, following their desires, moving on, claiming new lands, borrowing money. And by borrowing money, they use their capital, their assets to borrow money. Their assets were human people. So they commodify people to borrow money to expand their operations. I'd like to talk about Abraham Lincoln and those escaped refugee slaves who forced Lincoln's hand to do stuff that he didn't necessarily have in mind in 1861. I'd like to talk about Martin Luther King, wrote a biography of him, who expressed the civil rights movement with his visionary words, and of the ordinary men and women who put their lives on the line to actually make the movement move, and without which the figure that we know as Martin Luther King would not exist. And so I return to paraphrase a famous question from the Watergate era. What do historians know, or did, and when did they know it? See Richard Nixon on the left and Howard Baker there, the author of that particularly famous question of American history. We teach in classes of historiography precisely to explore that question and to look at the abundant varieties of answers to that question in the past. So what I'm going to do here is suggest some of the ways that a few of my personal historian heroes and heroines created new visions and that subsequent generations, including mine, have followed. The first is someone who was not by trade a historian, but was the genius of the 20th century, W.E.B. Du Bois. And he wrote in all different kinds he wrote poetry, he wrote songs, he wrote essays, he wrote political pamphlets, and he wrote one great book of history. I think it is the greatest book of history written about American history in the 20th century, Black Reconstruction in America, published in 1935, ignored by all white historians, and not even reviewed in the American Historical Review, the flagship journal of the historical profession. It presented a completely new vision of the Civil War and Reconstruction era, which to my mind is still the defining epic of American history. So how did Du Bois do this? Did he discover new documents, invent some new theory, find something that was hidden away from the world? No, he did not. What he did was to read the documents that others had read and simply ignored. And instead of ignoring them, he put them front and center. By doing so, he crafted a new history simply by paying attention to what others had ignored. Another historian hero, actually it's a hero for all historians, Marc Bloch, great French historian who created an entirely new field of history called the Annales School, which says, don't worry what the kings and queens and all those people were doing, study the long-term trends of history. So for example, environmental history comes out of his work, among other things. Marc Bloch was executed by the Nazis in 1944. He was part of the French resistance. And his last book that he wrote while in prison is a very stunning expose of it's called Strange Defeat, and he's trying to figure out what happened to France in this June of 1940, and it's just stunning to read. One final one, my more immediate heroes that I knew were my mentors at UC Berkeley, Lawrence Levine and Leon Litwack. I'll say something about Levine first. Levine gave me a B+ in his class. I don't think that he thought I would amount to much, honestly. I didn't do that well. But his book, Black Culture and Black Consciousness, Afro-American Folk Thought from Slavery to Freedom, published in 1977, was a central text in transforming the way that historians use folkloric sources, in particular songs, jokes, street talk, slang, etc. And he was writing about what were then in the 70s called street toasts, what we would now call rap. And he was explaining that to an audience in the 1970s before there was this thing that we know of as rap. And then Leon Litwack, formerly my mentor and for decades afterwards my friend and shining light of how to do this job I'm in. He taught an introductory lecture course at UC Berkeley for 800 students every spring, History 7B, it's a legendary class. In his lectures, he gave his interpretation of post-Civil War American history, and he did so in a totally retrograde way. No PowerPoints, no bells, no chat GPT, no lame attempts to make pop culture references that your students don't get because you're actually 10 years behind the times. He treated students as adults who could handle serious and searching explorations. I remember him playing Public Enemy's Fight the Power right after it was released in class, and he was so far ahead of the students of that time. It was astonishing. In terms of research, Leon's book, Been in the Storm So Long, which I read in one fevered night in 1983, changed my life. The last thing I ever thought I would do was study the thing that I had spent the last 35 years of my life studying. But it was thanks to him. As the character Gator says in Thomas Anderson's great film Magnolia, and the book says, we may be through with the past, but the past ain't through with us. This, of course, is a direct ripoff of William Faulkner. And I have here what I think of actually as the greatest novel of American history, Absalom, Absalom. Not an easy novel to teach, as I learned trying to teach it here, because it's a really difficult novel to read, but it's the most profound historical explanation written by a non-historian of all of the issues of slavery and race and the legacies of all that. The contemporary philosophers, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards, had their own way of putting it. It's just that demon life that got me in its sway. The demon life is the hunger for understanding, exactly as the French historian Marc Bloch, executed by the Nazis late in World War II, said, quote, when all is said and done, a single word, understanding is the beacon light of our studies. Understanding is a word pregnant with difficulties, but also with hope. And so I followed the trail to understand the issues I considered most fundamentally important to American history, and along the way discovered the nexus of religion, race, and democracy. That happens to be the title of the book I'm writing right now, but it's kind of like the one-sentence summary of my career. That's what I've worked on. Early in my career, my task as I saw it was to wrest Southern history, because I really trained in the history of the American South, to wrest it from its white supremacist assumption. So people used to say, I do this with students now, first day of Civil War class, who lost the Civil War? South. Okay, 60% of South Carolinians were African Americans. Did they lose the Civil War? Obviously they did not. And because they meet the South, because they have this older vision of it, I decided I was going to spend my career trying to change that. I don't think I've changed in the public perception, but I think it has changed, at least in the scholarly world. Later, and starting in the 1990s, my field emerged into something that we would now call American religious history. Certainly, people wrote religious history of various Americans before that. It's not like we were creating it. But I saw it as the task of our generation to create new narratives, less beholden to the hidebound stories of the past and more attuned to the dynamism, the emotion, the pluralism of the story. Contemporary critics ridiculously refer to this as woke history, but it's in fact better history, plain and simple. And so I spent years researching the history of race, religion, slavery, and democracy in the American South. A number of books came out of that, but the one that I think may be the sort of my final conclusions, published in 2016, is the one on the left there. Christianity and Race in the American South, A History. I think this book has sold maybe 400 copies. I don't care, I'm really proud of it. It's available used for like $5 on Amazon, by the way. It focuses on the paradoxes of Southern religious history from Jamestown to the present. One example is how the region has played a central role in fashioning a globalized world economy while maintaining a tribal provincialism marked by hostility to outside ideas and what they called in the 60s outside agitators. A religious culture defined by its biblicism, the Bible Belt, and piety sacralized astonishing levels of human cruelty. That same society nurtured, at the same time, human artistic creativity that burst through religious shibboleths. That's why all modern contemporary popular music is beholden to Southern music, because it all comes from there, ultimately. In few other places did such a diverse mixture of religious ideas and expression result in a dominant establishment so productive of extraordinary cruelty and so generative of astonishing creativity at the same time. In researching this subject, and I should say there's bits and pieces of that as well in The Color of Christ. Color of Christ is really about the divinization of whiteness and the demonization of blackness, both literally, that is in the images of Jesus. Jesus became a white man in the 1830s in America, that's what the book argues. And then it got mass-produced because you can mass-produce images starting in the 1830s. And by mass-producing whitened images of Jesus, it produced a sense of the divinization of whiteness and the demonization of blackness. And I'll say more about that just a little bit later. In researching this subject, or all my subjects, including the history of African American Christianity that you see there, as well as another book called Freedom's Coming, I wanted to really illustrate the lives of lesser known people. So I don't spend a lot of time talking about the people that you know a lot about already, but I tried to find the people that you don't so much about. And I'm going to talk about a couple of those here. The first, the handwritten thing here, which I know you can't read, but I'm going to read you a couple sentences from it, is from a group of slaves in South Carolina in 1723. This document was written to the Bishop of England. Goes to the Bishop of England. I don't know if he reads it or not. He gives it to somebody. And eventually, although it's in South Carolina, it gets filed in the wrong folder, and it ends up in Jamaica, in the archive there, where it's buried and nobody knows it exists. And then about 30 years ago, some scholars accidentally dug this out. And it is a letter of slaves, one of whom can write, as you see here, and he's writing the sentiments of the group. And he's explaining that, as he puts it, we are commanded to keep holy the Sabbath day, and we do hardly know when it comes, for our taskmasters are as hard with us as the Egyptians was with the children of Israel. And at the end they say, we dare not subscribe any man's name, you don't sign any man's name, to this for fear of our masters. For if they knew we have sent home to your honor, we should go near to swing upon the gallows tree. The gallows, contemporary language would say we would be lynched, effectively, is what they're saying. And I thought that's interesting because these are slaves who are devotees of the Church of England and want to be, and their masters are preventing them from doing so. And that's a very interesting twist on what we think of as the story of race and religion in American history. The second are petitions. The printed one are petitions from the 1790s in Virginia. So I was looking up a guy named John Leland, who's a Virginia Baptist in 1790. 1790, the Virginia Baptist Association has a resolution at the end of one of their meetings saying, essentially, slavery is contrary to the will of God, and that should be Baptist policy. This provoked an enormous firestorm of response, what I call the first viral disinformation campaign. I don't know if it's the first, but an early viral disinformation campaign in American history. So if you look at the bottom of the page, they're saying, what will be the result of slave emancipation such as has been proposed by our Baptist leaders? Answer: want, poverty, distress, and ruin to the free citizens, neglect, famine, and death to the black infant, the horrors of all the rapes, murders, and outrages which a vast multitude of unprincipled, unpropertied, revengeful, and remorseless banditti are capable of perpetrating, inevitable bankruptcy to the revenue, blah, 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 but it goes on. There's a whole other page of this stuff. So this guy's on a Facebook rant. So I was reading this, and I was reading a bunch of others, and they all said the same thing. Somebody made this thing go viral. And the reason they made it go viral is because they were squashing the little incipient light of anti-slavery rhetoric in the American South that emerged during the time of the American Revolution, had some traction for a decade or two, and then died. And what replaces it is the pro-slavery argument, that slavery is in fact the will of God. One other one. This is an African Methodist Episcopal minister named Henry McNeil Turner, kind of a favorite of mine. I think I've used him in 4 books now. So I like to recycle material. It's ecologically good to do that. And he's the originator, like we have this thing called Black Liberation Theology, and it's supposed to have originated in the 1960s. This is totally false. It originates in the late 19th century, and it originates with a number of people, but Turner, I think, is the most important one. Turner was the Union Army chaplain. He was born free in South Carolina, becomes a Union Army chaplain. He's a Methodist minister. After the war, he moves to Georgia to establish the AME Church, and he becomes a Georgia state legislator. And in 1870, black Georgia state legislators are driven out of office in a coup d'etat led by the Ku Klux Klan. White supremacists take control, and decades of really grim white supremacist rule in Georgia result at the end of that. And what Turner does is, in the 1880s, he sort of begins to give up hope that America is a place for African Americans. In 1890, he starts a magazine called The Voice of Missions. He goes to South Africa. He creates African Methodist Episcopal churches there. Those African Methodist Episcopal churches are the base for what becomes the African National Congress Party of Nelson Mandela. But Turner is there because he wants to promote African immigration because he's given up hope in America. He goes back and forth several times, the 1890s, early 20th century. He writes a famous essay for his publication in 1898 called God is a Negro. And he's not saying God is a Negro. He says, of course, God has no color, blah, blah, blah. But God has been given a color whether we like it or not. And we have a right to respond to that. And so those of you, the bulk of you is referring to his black audience, believe that God is white-skinned, blue-eyed, straight-haired, projecting nose, compressed lip, blah, 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 blah. And a white gentleman sitting somewhere on the throne. And he's talking about the divinization of whiteness and its devastating effects in American history. So these are the sort of documents I try to listen to and to incorporate in my works, precisely because they don't come from the greatest hits canon of American history, but they speak to the long-lived struggle for race, religion, and democracy in American history. So I kind of hope that I've gotten the South and that kind of thing out of my system, but I didn't get the general concepts of religion, race, and democracy out of my system. My past, as Faulkner said, was not dead. It was not even past. And so I want to conclude with some current projects, 2 books of which I hope to finish off my career, hopefully in a less inglorious way than my 40-year-old noon ball basketball career recently came to its very ugly, inglorious end. I'm working now on a book for Oxford Press called Religion, Race, and Democracy in American History, and it starts with a juxtaposition of 2 images that are going to be very familiar to you. Obviously, the March on Washington on August 28, 1963. March on Washington for jobs, justice, and freedom. It's important to say the whole title because that's what it was, unbeknownst to 99.9% of Americans today. The crowd of 250,000, the powerful speeches, the dream announced to the crowd, and everywhere FBI agents in surveillance mode because of their suspicion that Martin Luther King was, quote, the most dangerous Negro in America. They were right, by the way, he was. So the other photograph, you know where that comes from, January 6, 2021, the March on Washington. to overturn the results of a presidential election, the invasion of the Capitol, prayers delivered by insurrectionist leaders, Confederate flags flying among the violent crowd, something that never happened during the Civil War, ever, by the way, and the ongoing crises of democratic legitimacy in our day. So one day I got up and I was thinking, how do we get to this thing to that thing? I don't get it. And I was thinking, like, I grew up in rural Oklahoma. People were very conservative. They were also kind of rational, and they were nice. You know, if you disagreed with them, that was okay. You could have a debate. I had it with my father all the time. He was conservative, I wasn't, and we had a good time talking. And now people are completely nuts. What happened? So I'm going to write, I don't know what happened actually. I'm writing a book now to try to figure out what happened. So I begin with these two snapshots, and I'll put this in a more formal academic way. How did we get from the first expansive universalist vision of kings to the second divisively anti-democratic one? And what does religion have to do with it? I think it has a lot to do with it. I'm going to explain that in this book, I hope. In truth, those two visions and more always have been with us as part of a long contest basic to American social political history. And in tracing that history, my work suggests what possibilities may exist for restoring a purposely constructive democratic language. So it's the unresolved paradox of race and religion in American history. On the one hand, a nation that has enforced white supremacist Protestant norms. And secondly, an imagined nation of pluralism and equality, both in ideology and increasingly in demographic reality. I want to explore also anti-democratic conspiracy theories, hatred of the basic, religiously based hatred of the basic concepts of contemporary liberal arts higher education, and stupid cliches about defeating woke culture. Also much in evidence in contemporary politics. So while the legal definitions of citizenship may not have changed, visions of religion, race, and democracy remain contested. American traditions of religion, race, and democracy historically have ungirded movements both of anti-democratic exclusion and of democratic possibilities, both. Racially and religiously restricted notions of Americanness are a deep and at times definitive part of our history. So are the possibilities of pluralist democracy. Two moments of possibility have been lived out in the lives of two subjects that I've written biographies about, Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King. Again, some demon life had got me in its sway, because the last thing I ever thought I would do was write a biography. It was a genre that had never interested me as a writer. Then a few years ago, I started writing a biography. I'm not quite sure why, it just got me. I can tell you exactly when it got me. I was sitting in my front yard reading the biography of Howard Thurman about 6 or 7 years ago. And he talked about arriving, he was born a very poor boy in Florida in 1899, struggles and gets an education. In the 1930s, becomes a very well-known minister, goes to India, meets Indira Gandhi, brings back the home of the thoughts of nonviolent civil disobedience, which get transmitted to King. Long story short, the book is about that. But in the 1930s, he goes to San Francisco one time for a conference, gets off the ferry boat, walks down Market Street, and says, it was the first time I'd ever felt at home. I was reading that, and I thought, I had that exact same experience. I got to write this guy's biography. So I thought, let's find out what other biographies there are, so I don't repeat like what other people have said. Looked them up. There were none. I thought, wow, how could there be no biography of Howard Thurman? That's crazy. I contacted a publisher. The publisher said, we really want a biography of Martin Luther King. Will you write it for us? And I said, no, I won't. I want to write a biography of Howard Thurman. They said, who's that? I said, that's why I'm writing the biography, because I want to tell people who that is. So I didn't end up writing for them. I did say, okay, I'll write about King maybe for you later, but you're going to have to wait in line because I'm going to write this Thurman thing first. It turns out that someone else was writing a biography at the same time, a guy named Peter Eisenstadt. His biography was published about a year after mine. And so we became friends in the process. I got to know him. And here's the thing about history. We don't disagree about Howard Thurman, really. And we both wrote biographies. And there's no philosophical disagreement. There's no factual disagreement. But the books are totally different, because there's an infinite amount to say about any historical subject. And there could be 20 more books about Howard Thurman. And there are 1 million biographies of Martin Luther King. I wrote another one. I think it's different. I think I had something fresh to say. So to go on to King, I had been working, I wrote this book in about a year, basically during COVID. COVID was really good for my writing career, by the way. Thank you, COVID, because I stayed at home and sat there and write, nothing else to do. But in a sense, I didn't write it in a year because I started writing it in 1985 with Leon Litwack. And when I wrote a paper for him, he gave it an A-. And he said, the rough draft, he said, I found this draft very rough. And then he spent an hour and a half going through line by line, explaining, you're writing it in this way, that's not a good style. Here's a better way to write it. That was the most important hour and a half of my professional life. And it's something I do. I replicate exactly this thing now with students quite frequently. Students who often have good ideas but don't quite have the capacity yet to explain them very well. Another in a series of happy accidents, some years ago, simply to teach myself the subject, I created a class called Global History of World War II. One of my students sitting right there, you were in that class. I'm sorry, I can't remember your name, but I recognize you. We've taught this several times. Last time I taught it with Professors Yang Wei and Robert Sackett. So Sackett did Europe, Wei did Asia, I did the United States. And these classes are really fun to do. And during this class one time, many years ago, Yang Wei said, hey, I'm going to go to this conference on Chiang Kai-shek in China. You want to go? Just write something for this conference. Doesn't matter what it is, just say have a sentence about Chiang Kai-shek in there somewhere. Because the guy's funding it is a Chiang Kai-shek freak. And so he won't fund it unless you say something. I'm like, I don't know anything about Chiang Kai-shek. So I did what all undergraduate students do, and I Googled Chiang Kai-shek religion. Because I know religion, I don't know Chiang Kai-shek, but I know religion. First thing I found was a speech that Chiang Kai-shek gave in 1938, and it's a speech that sounds exactly like Woodrow Wilson. I thought, where did he get that from? I did not expect to see that. It's progressive Protestant internationalism. So I began to research. So I discovered the speech was basically ghostwritten by an American missionary named Frank Price. Francis W. Price, I call him Frank Price. I say American, he was actually born in China, and he was born in the exact province of China and almost the same time that Chiang Kai-shek was born. And they both spoke exactly the same sub-regional dialect of Mandarin. And in fact, when I talked to Chinese colleagues and told them about Frank Price, they're like, oh yeah, Mr. Price, we all know him. He's a renowned scholar of the Chinese language. I didn't know this. So I began to research this and write about it, and discovered a kind of whole world that completely fascinated me. And I called it Lost in Translation, because Frank Price thought that Chiang Kai-shek was going to be the great democratic leader of China. He was deluded. Chiang Kai-shek thought that Frank Price had all this pull with the American government and could get all this money and stuff during World War II. He was wrong. He couldn't. He was a missionary. He didn't work for the government. Later on, the CIA tried to recruit him, and he said, I'm a missionary. Don't try to recruit me because I'm not a spy. So to Price and his cohort of Protestant progressive liberal internationalists, Chiang Kai-shek spoke the language of Wilsonian idealism. And suffice to say, Frank Price's vision was doomed to failure. So I wrote a book called Southern Religion of the World, 3 stories. First one's about Price, and chapters about Price and Chiang Kai-shek. Second chapter is about Howard Thurman. It's kind of warming up for my biography. Third chapter is about Johnny Cash and Rosetta Tharpe, who I thought had more influence than anybody else in the book on the history of the world, by the way. And if you want to see how I say that. Oh, Johnny Cash, Rosetta Tharpe, and Lee Von Helm, the drummer for the band. They're all from the same exact county of Arkansas. And that was interesting to me. So anyway, I wrote about that. But this led me later to a project I want to finish my career with about global religious visions of World War II. World War II is the most violent conflict in human history. At least 50 million people perished, probably more like 70 million, maybe as many as 75 million. It's all kinds of figures that you can see in various history books. Most of them were civilians. It was the great apocalypse, and it was an apocalypse that had been foreseen in various religious traditions from all over the world. Ancient Hindu texts, for example, that Robert Oppenheimer famously later quotes, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." American fundamentalists who thought the apocalypse was coming. They were kind of right about that. And the religious eschatology that fed into the emperor worship in Japan. At the same time, religion was a force for conservatism, for traditional values infusing nationalism with the divine. And everywhere Jewish intellectuals, of course, had to cope with the impossibility of comprehending the Shoah. And I can't help thinking every year in my head, one survivor of Auschwitz recently said of her feelings on approaching Yom Kippur, God, forgive me for the sins I committed. Can I forgive you for the sins you committed? The war, I think, both furthered internationalist religious movements and nationalist movements, which relied on the support of regional religious elites. Many thought the war could cleanse the world of the very forces that created it. But they were too rooted in nationalist and religious ideas to be so easily erased. The forces unleashed by the global apocalypse could not be readily contained or tamed. So the end was, at best, the unresolved chord of the cold and broken hallelujah. And there's much more to say about that, so stay tuned. I'm going to conclude with this. 2 generations ago, the historian Richard Hofstadter said that Americans were, quote, born in perfection and aspired to progress. It's a very funny line referring to the utopian visions of the Puritans and the city on the hill and all that. That line now seems dated because we think of America as being born in original sin of slavery, and then aspiring to progress, sometimes reaching it, sometimes going backwards. Both of those views have their kind of metaphorical truths, but the metaphor in both cases is inapt. The United States as a nation state is a political entity, a creature driven by self-interest like all political entities are. It's the story of American life that we have so desired to give transcendent meanings to that political entity. And hence the term civil religion, although born from the writings of Jean-Jacques Rousseau in the 18th century, are now most famously and aptly applied to America. And so we wonder if the American democracy is about the striving for the hallelujah amid the cold and broken ruins of the inequalities of the past. To close with this. A book by my very good friend Jason Bivens, Jazz and American Religion, and he trying to describe jazz and religion both as trying to capture smoke in a bottle, and says it's to capture jazz and perhaps religion is to understand the lower frequencies of American music and spiritual expression. Lower frequencies refers to a line from the novel Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison, very famous last line. Who knows but that on the lower frequencies, I speak for you, is a classic of African-American literature. And I conclude with 2 important contemporary philosophers, Jerry Garcia and Leonard Cohen. Garcia would have been a historian in another life because he expresses that eureka moment in the archive when some historical argument emerges finally from the chaos of documents. In the strangest of places, if you look at it right, he famously sang. Jason Bivens writes, Spirit's rejoicing reveals the cracks of the world and of our languages, reminding me of Leonard Cohen's lines, ring the bells that still can ring, forget your perfect offering, there is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. I hope my books and my teaching leave students and readers both with a sense of the depth and anguish of the inequalities, the cold and broken lives crushed under the madness of the American dream, and at the same time, the hallelujah part, the way in which human rights struggles let the light in. Thank you guys for listening to me. Yep. Questions?
Since you've done a lot of research, and some of it appears to be from you, how do you know what you take out of that is true?
Because a lot of the stuff on the internet is just, for example, the document you saw there, it's just a scan from the archives, and it's published in academic journals, and it's been vetted and so forth. Sometimes you don't know, then you got to go find out, right? So, for example, I was going to call my biography of Howard Thurman something, which is a famous quote attributed to him, and I gave a talk one time with this quote, and I went to try to find that quote. I couldn't find it. Somebody made it up. And it was someone who actually interviewed Thurman, was trying to legitimately like summarize his philosophy. But Howard Thurman himself did not say that based on my research, so I had to like regrettably give up that quote, which is a very nice title for my book, and come up with another title. perhaps not quite so interesting. So sometimes you have to do that. Oftentimes they've been vetted, or you know where they come from, or you call someone and say, hey, have you seen that in that archive, and is it okay? Or researching Frank Price, his papers are at the George Marshall Library in Lexington, Virginia. And so they did all the scanning for me and created PDFs and sent them to me. Half of them were in Chinese. I had to get this Chinese guy I know to translate them for me. But they came directly. They were just scans from the archive. So it depends on the type of source it is and all kinds of things. But if you do nothing then just Google something and then reproduce it as students do, you get in trouble unless you kind of know what you're doing. Yeah.
So you've talked a lot about the lead up to the Civil War.
So you've talked a lot about the intersection of race and democracy in the early years leading up to the Civil War. What do you think about our current political state? How does that similar or different from what we saw leading up to the events of the Civil War?
I'm writing this book to figure this out. So I'm not a real big person to say history repeats itself and look, we're fighting with each other, that means we're going to have another Civil War. I don't really typically buy that kind of stuff. Although after January 6th it looked a little more plausible than I might have thought. But even that is not the arm. It's not 50,000 men clashing at Gettysburg for 2 days. I think what I would say is the basic contrast, the basic paradox of race and religion in American history is just a theme that runs through American history. That, I think, holds the two together. And two different visions. I'm going to use the language from another historian. I didn't make this up. He calls it civic nationalism, this kind of expansionist vision of democracy, and racial nationalism, which is to say only certain people actually can produce civic nationalism, and only they get the benefits of that. So that's a kind of a long, ongoing debate, fight in American history. The difference is there were a number of very particular issues that were completely specific to the Civil War era, namely the expansion of slavery to the territories to the west. So Lincoln's position, the Republicans' position, it was not anti-slavery, it was anti-expansion of slavery to the west. And he said that's where we draw the line. Basically, that caused the Civil War. And long story short, that's what they were fighting over. The other thing that I think holds the two together is when there is an amplification of rhetoric, such that the trust, kind of a level of trust that's necessary for the functioning of a democratic society, when that breaks down, and your political enemy is your mortal and philosophical enemy who is a traitor. That's kind of what happened in 1860. And I'm not saying that's going to happen now. I actually don't think it will. But when you see the breakdown of the norms of democratic discourse, it gives historians pause, because we think, okay, well, yeah, we kind of have seen this before. So when you read tracts of stuff that's published in the late 1850s, you can see like the train is going off the tracks. You can see it. Okay, I don't think it's gone off the tracks yet, but it would be wise for us to pay attention to that and do what we can to keep it from doing so.
Yeah, I just had a kind of riffing off of that question. You mentioned Henry McNeil, the voice of missions, and this idea that he kind of gave up on this idea of America being a place for, black freedom. And then when you contrast that, or when you compare that with W.E.B. Du Bois, who also kind of has this crisis of kind of democratic faith, dies in Ghana and Malcolm X. Where do you see the place for black democratic disillusionment in the history of race and religion?
Because I think internal to African American communities has been the same debate always about, is there a place for us here? So they're fighting about that all through the 19th century. Frederick Douglass and the Presbyterian minister named Henry Highland Garnett have a very famous debate in 1843 in Buffalo, New York. Garnett saying, this ain't gonna work, we have to start a violent revolution. And Douglass saying, there's no place for us here without that. And Douglass saying, if we start a violent revolution, we're just going to end up dead. That's a no-win strategy. So they have a debate about that. It's a very similar debate that you see played after the Civil War, see it through the 20th century. Du Bois is on all sides of that debate, and he lives a long time. He's 95 years old when he dies, and at one time or another, he's literally at every point on the political spectrum. Kind of a moderate when he's younger, and then he believes that academic sociology and scientific study will solve the race problem, and he learns that's not true. Then he becomes a communist, and then like communism doesn't work out so well, and then he becomes an African exile and dies the night before the March on Washington in 1963. So he's literally everywhere. And Turner is like the 19th century equivalent to Du Bois. I mean, he's not a genius like Du Bois, but he goes through the entire life cycle of the American political spectrum. And so there was always that debate and always that kind of fight. So my students in Civil Rights Seminar, Tara, David, this semester are going to read a book called The Sword and the Shield, The Revolutionary Lives of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X by a historian at the University of Texas, which basically argues at the end of the day, King and Malcolm X they would have never converged because they had some basic philosophical differences, but they were converging. So like they start here and they move to here. And then Malcolm X is assassinated, and then 3 years later, King is. But their philosophies were converging. And their philosophies had both come from these ends of the African-American political spectrum, but they learned from each other because they respected each other, I think. Yes?
You previously mentioned Gandhi and how his message has kind of spread throughout the world. Do you think that anti-violence rhetoric has kind of been lost in the discussion between race and politics?
No, I don't. Absolutely not. So I dedicated my biography of Martin Luther King to a guy named William Barber. I've never met him personally. I'm just a great admirer of him. I see him, he's a minister in North Carolina who started what's called the Moral Mondays movement. And the Moral Mondays movement was to protest movements in North Carolina in the 2010s towards disfranchising voters. They had an early victory because the Supreme Court of North Carolina actually overturned the legislature's plan, and they said the legislative plan was surgically, this is the exact language, was surgically targeted at African American voters, and it was. And they had some victories along those lines, and they had some losses. That's the way social movements go. You win some and you lose some. But he is the representative, in my opinion, one representative, not the only one, of that King tradition of nonviolent resistance. And there are many others that I could name as well. I think they're all over the place. The difference now is we don't have a central, like King becomes like, he's sort of thrown up as the symbol, somewhat against his plan. Like he moved to Alabama to hide out and finish his PhD dissertation. And suddenly he's the leader of the Montgomery bus boycott. That was a total accident. But once he comes to understand maybe God has called him to this role and he has to do it. And there was no kind of figure like that now. And maybe there should not be a figure like that now, because of all the good things about Martin Luther King, one of the bad things is when a movement depends on a charismatic leader, when the charismatic leader dies, so does the movement. And that's not a good thing. So I'm saying there's no central figure, but I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way. Sometimes all kinds of varieties of local movements led by relatively unknown people may be the better way to go. Yes?
Okay. When people talk about religion, they think they know what they're talking about.
But I was wondering, as a historian, do you have to have some kind of a definition of what religion is in order to talk about it?
This is the eternal fight between, I'm really in two fields. So history, and we're like, if people call themselves religious, fine, we're just going to roll with that. Then there's a field called religious studies. And religious studies is all about debating what is the definition of the term religion. That's kind of the fundamental thing that they do. And religion was like the term itself is an invention of the modern world, and it's a colonial category and all this kind of stuff, all of which is true. None of which affects the fact that the people I'm writing about consider themselves to be parts of religious tradition, and I'm mostly interested in that. The theoretical debates about the categories of religion, which obsessed religious studies scholar I read and follow, and at the end of the day, I just can't get excited about that debate. It just doesn't move me to write anything. So, but it's important, and I respect what they do. It's just not my thing. And so I don't really go with definitions of religion so much as like when there is something identifiably in practice, a group that has some kind of transcendent ideal by which they want the world to work. Okay, we will call that religion. Fine.
Please join me in a round of applause. Just have some closing remarks. First of all, thank you for joining us today for this wonderful talk. I know everybody's got their share of meetings to attend and chores to do, and there's so much competing for our priorities and time, so taking this welcome break from your long to-do list to learn together from Dr. Harvey, I hope that you got as much out of it as I know I did. It takes a lot to put on an event like this, so I want to thank Lindsay Copa and the Office of Research team, Office of Institutional Technology, the event services, everybody that it takes to pull out chairs and extra tables, because what a great turnout today. So round of applause for the planning team, thank you. Sharing, disseminating research is a really critical part of the knowledge production process, and doing things like this to learn something new is what makes our academic communities so rich and nourishing, and there is more to come. We will continue this series in the fall 2023 semester with another presentation from one of our other distinguished professors, so please keep an eye out for our future communications on that, and we hope to see you then. So thank you for joining us, and take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Everybody, please go grab some food on the way out.
Doing good, how are you? I missed UCCS by semester.